The groom's wealthy parents looked down on his poor in-laws, but he took an action that made them deeply regret it. Ethan Reynolds was born into a life that most could only imagine in fairy tales or glossy magazine covers. The Reynolds estate sat on a sprawling 20-acre property in the green heart of Connecticut, complete with fountains, tennis courts, and a driveway longer than most rural roads. His parents, Richard and Victoria Reynolds, were pillars of the elite, with Richard commanding one of the largest real estate conglomerates in the Northeast, and Victoria chairing several high society philanthropic boards. From the moment Ethan was born, his life was charted with precision. Private tutors, summers in Europe, fencing lessons, and piano recitals. His adolescence was spent within the walls of elite prep schools, learning not just about economics and literature, but about the weight of a family name. Despite the opulence that surrounded him, Ethan had always harbored a quiet curiosity about the world beyond the gates of his upbringing. There was a warmth missing from the cold perfection of his home, and he often wondered what genuine connection felt like, untainted by status or reputation. That curiosity followed him to Boston, where he enrolled at a prestigious university, majoring in business and technology. It was there, during a late-night volunteer tutoring session at a community center near campus, that he met Maya Carter. Maya's world was a stark contrast to Ethan's. She was the daughter of Tom Carter, a local mechanic who ran his own modest garage in a quiet suburb of Boston, and Linda Carter, a passionate and patient public school teacher who believed education could change the world. Maya had grown up sharing a room with her two younger siblings, learning early on that strength didn't come from wealth, but from compassion, resilience, and hard work. She had dreams of starting a non-profit one day, dedicated to improving access to education in underfunded communities. Their first conversation was about a malfunctioning printer at the community center. Ethan had tried to fix it and failed miserably, while Maya walked in, took one look at the mess he made, and fixed it in under 5 minutes. She teased him about it with a laugh that Ethan instantly found magnetic. That moment was the beginning of something Ethan never anticipated. What started with small conversations over coffee turned into long walks around the Charles River, late-night calls discussing philosophy and family, and eventually a deep and undeniable love. For Ethan, Maya was the embodiment of everything he had never experienced: authenticity, empathy, and an unshakable belief in doing what was right, regardless of appearances. For Maya, Ethan was a reminder that people could defy their backgrounds. That privilege didn't always mean arrogance, and that love could blossom in the most unexpected of places. But as their relationship deepened, so too did the awareness of their differences. It wasn't just about money. It was about worlds colliding. The first time Ethan invited Maya to his family's estate, she hesitated. She knew her simple jeans and cardigan would feel out of place among designer gowns and tailored suits. And she was right. The staff greeted her with polite but puzzled expressions. The furniture seemed too elegant to sit on, and every corner of the house whispered, "You don't belong here." Still, Maya endured it for Ethan. She believed in their bond, in their shared vision for the future. But she also knew deep down that the true test wouldn't be the stares of servants or the judgmental glances of distant relatives. It would be Ethan's parents. Richard and Victoria were not unkind in the overt sense. They were refined enough to mask disdain behind courteous smiles and carefully worded remarks. But beneath the surface, Maya sensed it all. The way Victoria asked about her parents' professions with a thinly veiled smirk. The way Richard avoided eye contact, as if she were invisible. And the way they talked about expectations and heritage when Ethan was out of the room. Ethan saw it too, though he tried at first to minimize it. "They just need time," he'd say. "They're not used to this." But Maya wasn't naive. She'd seen those same looks before: teachers who underestimated her because of her zip code, customers who treated her father like he wasn't a business owner, but just a grease-covered worker. She knew what condescension felt like. And so, while their love grew stronger, so did the storm clouds looming overhead. Ethan found himself caught between two worlds, one of opulence, legacy, and expectation, and the other of humility, love, and sincerity. It wasn't long before he would have to choose which world he truly belonged to, but Ethan Reynolds had never been one to take the easy road. What he was about to do would change everything, not just for him and Maya, but for two families on opposite ends of the American dream. Ethan had been thinking about the dinner for weeks. It was meant to be a gesture of unity, a step toward blending the two most important parts of his life, his family and the woman he loved. Maya had been hesitant when he first proposed the idea, but her love for Ethan outweighed her apprehension. She knew how important it was to him. And so on a cool Friday evening, the Carters made their way to the Reynolds estate, dressed in their Sunday best, though their modest clothes stood in stark contrast to the gilded world they were about to enter. Tom Carter wore a navy blazer. That was slightly too big at the shoulders, and Linda had styled her hair with care, donning a soft blue dress and her favorite necklace, the same one she wore on her wedding day. They held hands as they walked up the marble steps, their eyes filled with nervous anticipation. Maya walked slightly ahead, glancing back with a reassuring smile. Ethan greeted them at the door, his heart warmed by their presence and proud to show them a part of his life they had only heard about. But from the moment they crossed the threshold, the tension was palpable. Victoria Reynolds greeted them with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She kissed Ethan on the cheek, then turned to Maya with a perfunctory embrace. "So lovely to have you all here," she said, her voice dripping with civility. "We've been looking forward to this." Richard offered a curt nod, shook Tom's hand without enthusiasm, and avoided looking directly at Linda altogether. He muttered something about a stock call he had to finish before dinner, then disappeared down the hall. The Carters were ushered into the living room, a cavernous space with high ceilings, towering bookshelves and antique furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. They sat stiffly on the edge of a velvet sofa while Victoria poured them wine, expensive, imported, and far too strong for Tom's taste. Maya sat close to her parents, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Ethan sat beside her, trying to maintain calm, pretending not to notice the judgmental glances his mother cast when Tom mentioned the Boston traffic or when Linda spoke of her third-grade students. "So, Tom," Victoria began, swirling her glass of wine, "you work with your hands, I hear. Must be very grounding." She smiled, but it wasn't kind. Tom chuckled politely, though his cheeks reddened. "Yes, Mom. Been running my own garage for a little over 20 years now." "That's quite impressive," she said, the edge in her voice unmistakable. "And Linda, a teacher. I've always said it takes a special kind of person to deal with that kind of environment." Linda nodded, trying to keep the conversation light. "It can be challenging, but the kids are worth it. Every one of them has potential." Victoria smiled, again tighter this time. "Indeed, though I imagine it must be difficult when many of them, well, come from less fortunate backgrounds." Maya's smile faded slightly. She saw the discomfort flash across her mother's face, the way her father shifted in his seat. Ethan remained quiet, his eyes fixed on his mother, his jaw tightening. He recognized the tone, soft, polite, and loaded with condescension. He had heard it before at galas and brunches, whispered behind closed doors when people like the Carters weren't around to hear it. But this time it was directed at the people he had grown to admire most. Dinner was announced soon after. The table was set with ornate silverware and fine china, a centerpiece of white orchids stretching across its length. As they sat, Victoria began steering the conversation toward more familiar terrain: real estate trends, investment portfolios, recent trips to Tuscany. Richard finally joined them, speaking only when prompted, and barely acknowledging the Carters' presence. At one point he turned to Tom. "So, business must be tough these days, with electric cars and all. Do you ever think of upgrading?" Tom, who had rebuilt dozens of engines by hand and worked 12-hour days for decades, forced a smile. "There's always something new to learn. We do our best to adapt." Richard nodded vaguely, then turned to Ethan. "Have you given more thought to the Manhattan project we discussed? I spoke to the board again. They're eager." Ethan glanced at Maya, then at her parents. "We can talk about it later." Maya's silence was deafening. She ate little, smiling when spoken to but avoiding eye contact with Victoria, whose questions became increasingly pointed. "How did you two meet again?" she asked, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. "At a community center," Maya replied. "We were both volunteering." Victoria tilted her head. "How charming. Ethan's always been drawn to causes." Maya said nothing. She saw what this was, a test, a performance, a subtle interrogation cloaked in etiquette. She had known it might happen, but the reality was worse than she imagined. It wasn't just about money, it was about worth, about pedigree, about who was deemed suitable to sit at this table. After dessert, which no one enjoyed, Ethan walked the Carters out. The night air was cool and the stars above seemed indifferent to the tension still clinging to everyone's shoulders. Tom shook Ethan's hand firmly. "You've got a good heart, son, don't lose it." Linda hugged him gently. "Take care of her." Maya stood with Ethan for a moment longer before getting into the car. "I knew it would be hard," she said softly. "But I didn't expect them to be so polished in their cruelty." Ethan looked at her, his heart heavy with shame and fury. "I saw it all, and I'm sorry." As the Carters drove away, he stood alone on the front steps, watching their taillights disappear down the long, winding driveway. Inside, his parents were likely discussing how gracious they had been, how they had tolerated the evening for his sake. But Ethan knew better. He had seen the truth behind the key, silk curtains and crystal glasses. And though he hadn't said much during dinner, something inside him had begun to shift. The people who raised him had shown their true faces, and he would not forget it. The morning sun filtered through the wide windows of the Reynolds estate, casting a golden glow across the pristine breakfast room, but the warmth of the light did nothing to soften the air between mother and son. Ethan sat at the long glass table, staring blankly at a plate of untouched fruit. Victoria entered, graceful as ever, her silk robe fluttering slightly as she poured herself a cup of tea. The silence between them was deliberate, thick with the remnants of the night before. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she moved about the kitchen with a casual elegance that belied the sharpness she carried within. Finally, without looking at him, she said, "That was quite an evening." Ethan lifted his gaze. It was. Victoria sipped her tea, then set it down gently, turning toward him. "I was polite. I was civil. More than civil, actually." "You were condescending," Ethan replied calmly. "And so was Dad." Victoria's brow lifted just slightly, not in surprise but in the way someone does when mildly annoyed. "Ethan, we've worked our entire lives to maintain a certain standard, a certain level of refinement. We have a reputation, a legacy." "And they're good people," Ethan interrupted. "More genuine than half the guests you entertain." She pursed her lips, then sat across from him. "This isn't about them being bad people. It's about compatibility, culture, vision. Do you really think you can build a future with someone who comes from such a different world?" Ethan leaned forward. "You mean someone who wasn't born into money?" Victoria's voice remained level, but her fingers tightened slightly around her teacup. "It's not that simple, you know that." "Do I?" he asked. "Because it seems pretty clear to me. You think Maya and her family aren't good enough?" Victoria didn't answer. Immediately, she folded her hands, staring at her son. "Ethan, there are things you can't understand yet. Things about business, about influence, about how alliances are formed. Marrying someone from a different background, someone who doesn't understand our world, can complicate everything. It sends the wrong message to our partners, to the board." He shook his head. "You talk about love like it's a corporate transaction." "To some extent it is," she said, "especially when you carry the Reynolds name." Before Ethan could respond, Richard entered the room, his presence commanding as always. He wore a tailored suit, even though it was barely 8 o'clock in the morning. "I assume you're talking about last night," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Victoria glanced at him, then back at Ethan. "Your father and I have been discussing your future." "I figured as much." Richard sat at the head of the table. "You're a smart man, Ethan. You've shown promise. The way you handled the Boston property deal last quarter, it impressed the board. They want you more involved, and we're ready to accelerate your position." Ethan studied him. "What does that mean?" "It means a promotion, senior partner, immediate access to the Manhattan development, and a new place. We've been holding a penthouse on Park Avenue." Ethan felt the weight of the offer hit. Him, and then the shadow that followed it. And the catch? Richard's eyes didn't waver. You know what it is. Victoria spoke softly. This infatuation. It's admirable, sweet even, but it's not practical and it's not sustainable. Ethan's voice dropped. You want me to walk away from Maya? Richard nodded. She's a good girl, but not for this life. Not for you, not long term. You marry her, and you lose more than you realize. Ethan sat back, his chest tight. For a moment he was silent. Then he said, So I trade my soul for a view of Central Park? Victoria's expression hardened. We're offering you a future. Ethan stood up slowly, every movement deliberate. No, you're offering me a cage, one with velvet walls and golden locks. Richard's voice grew firmer. You're making a mistake. You're letting emotion cloud your judgment. Ethan turned toward them. And you're letting pride destroy your humanity. He left the room without another word, his footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. The doors shut behind him, and the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the beginning of a fracture that would only grow. Upstairs, in the privacy of his childhood room, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over Maya's name. He thought of her mother's quiet grace, her father's steady strength. He thought of the way she had smiled at him during the most awkward moments of the dinner, trying to hold everything together. He called her. She answered quickly. Hey, everything okay? He paused. No, but I needed to hear your voice. Maya was quiet for a moment, then she said, What happened? They made me an offer, promotion, apartment, everything, but only if I walk away from you. Her voice didn't shake. And what did you say? I didn't say anything yet, he admitted. I walked out. Maya's voice softened. You don't have to choose right now. But Ethan already knew the answer. I do and I will. After ending the call, he sat in silence, watching the wind sway the trees outside the window. His thoughts ran wild, not with fear, but with resolve. For so long he had done what was expected, every step measured, every choice approved by his parents' unspoken rules. But not this time. Later that day, he returned to the dining room. His parents were still there, finishing breakfast as if nothing had happened. He stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. I'm not taking the offer, he said. I'm staying with Maya. Victoria's fork paused in midair. Richard didn't move. I'm not giving up on someone I love, just to fit into a mold that never suited me. And if that means I lose your support, so be it. Victoria set down her utensils. You don't know what you're giving up. Yes, I do, he replied, and I'm fine with it. He left them again, this time without waiting for a response. His heart was pounding, but it was clear. For the first time in his life, he had chosen his own path, one not paved with gold but with truth, and there would be no turning back. The annual Reynolds Foundation Gala was one of the most anticipated events on the East Coast social calendar. Held at the Boston Museum of Art, it was a glittering evening of gowns, tuxedos, champagne towers, and silent auctions for causes carefully selected to reinforce the Reynolds brand as benevolent aristocracy. The event served as a showcase not only for the company's philanthropy, but for the Reynolds family itself, particularly Ethan, the heir apparent. That year, however, the guest list included names that sent subtle ripples through the planning committee, Tom and Linda Carter. Their invitation had come directly from Ethan, who insisted on their attendance. Their family, he had told the event coordinator with finality. He had made it clear to his parents that this gesture was non-negotiable, and though Victoria had initially resisted, she ultimately relented under the guise of diplomacy. Richard had not offered an opinion. He rarely did when he disapproved. He simply allowed his silence to say everything. The Carters arrived early that evening, Maya proudly between them, wearing a flowing burgundy dress that she had chosen for Bay, its elegance and affordability. Tom wore his only tuxedo, borrowed from a friend, and Linda had had her hair done at a local salon that morning, a quiet indulgence for a night that felt far outside her world. The museum's grand staircase loomed before them, flooded with flashbulbs and guests who smelled of power. Inside, a string quartet played near the lobby, and guests milled around, exchanging pleasantries over sparkling flutes. Ethan met them at the entrance with a wide smile and took Maya's hand in his. He hugged her parents, and for a moment things felt right. But as they moved further into the venue, Ethan noticed the subtle changes, the strained smiles from staff, the long glances exchanged by the event managers, and the clipboard whisperers hovering near the seating chart. Near the main ballroom, a hostess approached. "Mr. Reynolds," she said to Ethan, a touch of panic beneath her polished voice, "there's been a last-minute change to the seating arrangements." "What kind of change?" Ethan asked, his tone even but alert. She hesitated. "Your parents requested some reassignments to better accommodate the guest list hierarchy." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What exactly does that mean?" Before she could answer, Maya tugged his sleeve. She had just seen the table card bearing her parents' names, Table 27, placed near the rear of the room, behind a display and adjacent to the catering entrance. It was distant, enough to feel like exile. Ethan stared at the card for a long second. Then he looked around and realized what had happened. The Reynolds family and their closest allies were seated front and center, surrounded by a curated circle of CEOs, senators, and high-profile donors. The Carters were being hidden, displaced under the pretense of logistics, but in reality, isolated as if their presence was a blemish to be managed. Tom and Linda didn't complain. They simply smiled, nodded politely, and followed the usher to their table. Tom whispered to Maya on the way, "It's all right, honey, we're not here for the spotlight." But Ethan's face had gone pale with fury. He said nothing, only excused himself and stepped out onto the balcony to breathe. Inside, the gala continued as planned. Victoria took to the stage shortly after the appetizer course, delivering her usual speech about legacy, vision, and giving back to the community. She thanked the board, the donors, and the volunteers, except conspicuously the Carters, who had been invited as guests of honor by their son. When Ethan returned, his demeanor had changed. He sat beside Maya, his hand gripping hers. He looked across the room at his parents, his jaw tense. Maya leaned in. "Don't do anything tonight, please." He nodded, but his mind was already racing. The pain wasn't just in the gesture, it was in what it meant. It was in the way Linda Carter had smiled despite the insult, in the way Tom had sat straight-backed and proud even at the edge of the room. It was in the quiet dignity they carried, contrasted with the curated cruelty of the people who claimed to represent sophistication. During dinner, a photographer moved through the tables, capturing the evening. When he reached table 27, he hesitated before lifting his camera. Then he lowered it. Ethan saw the moment unfold like a script. After dessert, Maya excused herself to the restroom. Ethan remained seated with her parents, and for a long time they sat in silence, listening to the distant laughter from the center of the room. "Thank you for inviting us," Linda finally said, her voice steady. "It means a lot, even like this." Ethan turned to her. "I'm sorry." She smiled gently. "You didn't do anything wrong." Tom looked at him. "You love her. That's what matters." But Ethan knew something had been broken. Not the relationship itself. His love for Maya remained unshaken, but his faith in the people who raised him, the calculated effort to belittle, to control, to protect their image at the expense of human decency. It was no longer something he could rationalize or forgive. By the end of the evening, as the final speeches were delivered and the orchestra played their last set, the Carters quietly slipped out. Maya found Ethan near the exit, alone again. She could see the storm behind his eyes. "They didn't just seat us back there," she said quietly. "They wanted to prove a point." Ethan nodded. They did. They walked out into the night, hand in hand, the laughter and glittering lights behind them dimming with each step. The humiliation had not been loud. It had not needed to be. But it had echoed within Ethan, louder than any argument ever could. And it would not be forgotten. The air in the Reynolds estate had changed. After the gala, Ethan no longer moved through the house as a son merely visiting or respecting tradition. He moved with a quiet determination, aware now of the cost of that tradition, of the lives it excluded and the hearts it wounded. There, was a tension in every exchange with his parents. Words were fewer, the silences heavier. Victoria resumed her routines, pretending nothing had shifted, while Richard buried himself in meetings and travel, avoiding confrontation as he always did. Ethan, however, couldn't return to normal, not after seeing the pain in Maya's eyes and the resignation in her parents' posture. One rainy afternoon, while seeking solitude in the library wing of the mansion, Ethan found himself drawn to a part of the house he hadn't visited in years, the old study of his grandfather, Edwin Reynolds. Edwin had died when Ethan was still a teenager, remembered vaguely as a stern but kind man, less imposing than Richard and far more grounded. The study remained untouched for years, preserved like a museum piece by Victoria, who deemed it a symbol of their family's legacy. The room smelled of aged wood and dust. Shelves lined the walls, filled with business ledgers, history books, hand-framed photographs. Ethan drifted between them, glancing at pictures of men in suits shaking hands, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, early real estate projects. On the desk sat a globe, yellowed with time, and a collection of fountain pens arranged with military precision. Behind the desk was a cabinet with a faded brass handle. Curiosity tugged at him. When he opened the cabinet, he found rows of old documents, ledgers from the 1960s and 70s, and a small metal box, locked but not sealed. Inside the box, beneath a stack of tax receipts and property titles, was a single envelope marked with a shaky, handwritten label, "For Ethan, when." "He is ready." His chest tightened. Carefully, he slid the letter from the envelope. The paper was thick, the ink slightly faded. It was written in Edwin's hand, firm, deliberate, and personal. "My dear grandson, if you are reading this, it means that something in your heart has shifted. Maybe you are questioning the legacy we have built, or perhaps you are beginning to see the cracks we've all tried to ignore. I know what this family looks like to the world, wealthy, successful, untouchable, but the truth, Ethan, is that we came from nothing. I was the son of a factory worker. Your grandmother's family ran a small diner. We built what we have now brick by brick, not through inheritance, but sacrifice. What I regret most is how in the process of rising, we began to look down on where we came from. I watched your father distance himself from our roots. I watched your mother embrace a version of success that left no room for humility. I tried to remind them, but I was too soft in my old age and perhaps too complicit in my youth. You, however, are different. I saw it in you as a boy. You listened more than you spoke. You asked questions others ignored. If you find this letter, I want you to know it's not too late to be the bridge between what we were and what we've become. Wealth without empathy is just a gilded prison. Don't forget who we were, Ethan, and don't be afraid to walk away from who they expect you to be. Edwin. Ethan read the letter twice. The second time, his hands shook. It was a truth buried beneath decades of denial. His grandfather, the man whose name graced plaques across the state, had come from the very same background his parents now disdained, the same working-class roots they pretended to have never known. Richard had hidden it so well that even Ethan had believed the illusion. The photographs, the tailored suits, the charity galas, they were all part of a story carefully rewritten. He sat there for a long time, the letter in his lap, the rain tapping softly against the windows. Memories surfaced, of Edwin teaching him how to fix a broken latch on the garden gate, of quiet talks by the fire, of his grandfather's pride when Ethan had gotten accepted into college, not because of the family name, but because of his own merit. Ethan folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. He knew then that the divide between himself and his parents was not just emotional, it was philosophical. They weren't merely different in temperament or taste. They had abandoned something essential, their own past and the humility it once demanded. That evening over dinner, Ethan brought up the letter. "I went through Grandpa's old study," he said, his tone steady. "I found something." Victoria looked up from her plate. Richard didn't react. "He left me a letter, said he came from a factory town, that Grandma's parents ran a diner." Victoria's fork paused mid-air. "That's ancient history, Ethan. Your grandfather always liked to romanticize his youth." He didn't romanticize it, Ethan replied. He warned me not to forget it. Richard wiped his mouth with a napkin. What's your point? My point is, Ethan said slowly, you've built an empire trying to bury the truth, pretending we've always been better, more refined, but it's all a lie. Victoria's face remained calm, but her voice tightened. We worked hard. How to build this family's name. There's no shame in improving our station. There is, Ethan said, if you use that improvement to shame others. Richard stood up, pushing his chair back. You're acting like a child. No, Ethan said, rising as well. I'm finally acting like myself. He walked out of the dining room, past the columns and chandeliers, back to the study where he took the letter and placed it in his own coat pocket. His grandfather had trusted him with the truth. Now it was time to live by it, not just in thought, but in action. The following days passed like slow-moving fog. Ethan moved through the Reynolds estate with a sense of detachment, as though each room now belonged to a world he no longer recognized. He would stand in the hallway and look at the oil paintings of stoic men, former Reynolds patriarchs, all frozen in grandeur, and feel a strange sorrow. The wealth, the legacy, the expectations, none of it held meaning anymore. Not since the gala, not since the letter, not since the moment he saw Maya's mother sit behind a curtain in a $1,000 dress that had been meant to hide her. He knew it was time. The decision was no longer a question of courage, but of integrity. He was not afraid of his parents' reaction. He had passed that point. What weighed heavier was the realization that everything he had been groomed for was built upon a structure that rejected the very values he believed in. Ethan had always thought that success would eventually allow him to redefine the family legacy from within, but he now understood. There was no changing the architecture of a house designed to exclude. One morning he scheduled a private meeting in the boardroom of Reynolds Global, summoning his parents and several members of the executive committee. The same room where billion-dollar projects had been greenlit, where contracts had been signed under crystal chandeliers, now felt claustrophobic. Ethan stood at the end of the long mahogany table, his posture composed but his heart resolute. Richard sat near the center, flanked by two trusted partners. Victoria entered last, wearing a pearl necklace and a calm expression that disguised 1,000 calculations. The chatter in the room quieted as Ethan stepped forward. I called this meeting, he began, because it's time I made something clear. For all of us. The eyes around the table turned toward him. He took a breath. I'm stepping down from my role at Reynolds Global, effective immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard leaned forward. What are you talking about? I'm leaving the company, Ethan said plainly. I will not take the Manhattan project. I won't lead future acquisitions. I'm done pretending this is where I belong. Victoria blinked slowly, her face composed. Ethan, let's speak privately. This isn't the forum. This is exactly the forum, Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. Because I need everyone here to understand something. I've watched this company, and this family, turn its back on people who don't fit. They're a certain mold. I've watched opportunities be hoarded, partnerships formed based on appearance, and values dictated by status. I've seen firsthand how easily we forget where we came from. I won't be part of it anymore. One of the board members cleared his throat. This feels impulsive. No, Ethan replied. It's overdue. Richard's voice was low and measured. You're throwing away your future. No, Ethan said. I'm building a new one. Victoria's mask finally cracked. Do you even understand what you're giving up? The power, the influence, I understand it perfectly, Ethan cut in, and I'm choosing something else. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. My grandfather wrote me a letter before he died. In it, he talked about how we came from nothing, about how we used to believe in work, not just wealth, about how you both forgot that. Victoria's eyes flickered. Richard's jaw tightened. I'm starting my own company, Ethan continued. It won't be built on status. It'll be built on inclusion, on opportunity, on creating something real for people who've been shut out of the systems we profit from. One of the executives spoke hesitantly. And what exactly do you plan to do? A technology startup, Ethan said, focused on education access, mentorships for underserved communities, training for students in public schools like the ones Maya went to, like the ones her mother teaches in. The name Maya hung in the air like a quiet rebellion. "I've already secured a small investment," he added, "and I'm moving to Somerville this week." Victoria looked like she had been slapped. "You're leaving this house?" "I'm leaving this house, this company, and this role. But I'm not walking away, I'm walking towards something better." Richard stood. "You'll regret this." Ethan looked at him, not with anger, but with finality. "I don't think I will." The meeting ended in silence. Ethan collected his things and walked out of the boardroom for the last time. As he stepped into the elevator, he didn't feel the weight of loss, but the quiet, steady lift of freedom. Later that day, he packed only what he needed: his laptop, a few clothes, the letter from Edwin, and a framed photo of Maya and her parents from their first trip to Cape Cod. He didn't take the tailored suits or the engraved cufflinks. He didn't need them. He called Maya that night, his voice calm. "I left the company," he said. "I'm starting over." There was a pause on the line, then her voice soft and sure. "I'm proud of you." With the Carters' help, Ethan moved into a modest apartment in Somerville, a world away from Connecticut's marble halls. The space was small, just one bedroom, a galley kitchen, and a creaky wooden floor, but it felt alive. Maya helped paint the walls a bright white. Tom brought over a toolkit and fixed a leaky faucet. Linda stocked the pantry with groceries and left a note on the fridge. "You'll do great things." Within a week, Ethan had launched the first phase of his startup. He called it Rise Collective. It began with 5 students from Boston public schools and 2 retired educators volunteering their time. Ethan worked from a borrowed desk in a co-working space. The funding was tight, the days long, and the challenges immense. But for the first time in his life, Ethan didn't measure his worth by spreadsheets or boardroom votes. He measured it in the light in a student's eyes when they solved their first coding problem, in the way Linda smiled when he updated her on their progress, in the respect Tom showed him, not because of his last name, but because of his choices. As he lay in bed each night, surrounded by the hum of traffic and the distant sounds of the city, Ethan felt something rare and unfamiliar: peace. The legacy he had left behind was vast, but the one he was building now, it had roots, it had soul, and it had just begun. The first Monday morning in Somerville came with a breeze that rattled the old window panes of Ethan's apartment and carried with it the promise of something different. The modest space, though still half empty, already felt more like home than the mansion in Connecticut ever had. A desk in the corner, a laptop resting on it, and scattered notes on whiteboards across the wall reflected a man in motion. A man building something from the ground up, no longer defined by inheritance, but by vision. The startup, Rise Collective, began not with flashy launches or sleek marketing campaigns, but with quiet, deliberate steps. Ethan had secured a shared space in a local innovation hub where small tech entrepreneurs worked side by side with non-profit founders, teachers, and activists. The place buzzed with a different kind of energy, earnest, gritty, purpose-driven. Every desk told a story, and every face carried a cause. Ethan's first team was humble in number, but rich in commitment. 2 educators retired from the Boston public school system. Mrs. Hargrove and Mr. Lane agreed to come on board as mentors. Mrs. Hargrove had taught science for 35 years and believed that real education was what you do with your hands and your heart. Mr. Lane had been a high school computer science teacher before district cuts forced his early retirement. They saw in Ethan what he didn't always see in himself, a leader worth following. The first group of students came from schools in Roxbury, Dorchester and Mattapan, neighborhoods long neglected by systemic underfunding and dismissed by private investors. Ethan personally visited each school, meeting with skeptical administrators, persuasive principals, and hopeful students. His pitch was simple: free coding workshops, mentorship, and job shadowing opportunities focused on real-world skills that could lead to real-world jobs. He remembered one moment in particular. A 13-year-old named Julian had stared at him with wary eyes as Ethan described what they'd be doing. "Why would you care about a kid like me?" the boy asked. Ethan knelt beside him, looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Because someone should have cared sooner. Julian signed up that day. So did 11 others. That first cohort became the heartbeat of Rise Collective. Maya was there every step of the way. Though her work at the non-profit kept her busy, she found time to help with grant writing, curriculum, design, and even food delivery for late-night coding sessions. On weekends, she and Ethan held informal roundtables in their apartment, inviting the students and their families to talk about their dreams and fears. They served pasta, shared stories, and built something Ethan had never truly known before: community. But it wasn't all progress and passion. The startup world, even in its most noble form, was brutal. Funds ran low faster than expected. One of the initial donors pulled out, citing uncertain returns. Ethan faced more than one sleepless night, staring at a dwindling budget and a growing wait list of students he didn't yet have the capacity to support. He refused to ask his parents for help, not because of pride, but because of principle. This was not their world, and their money came with conditions he could no longer accept. Instead, he reached out to Maya's network, tapped into local business owners, and cold-called dozens of community foundations. Slowly, painfully, small checks began to come in. $500 here, $1,000 there. It wasn't much, but it kept the lights on and the dream alive. And as Rise Collective began to grow, so did the attention. A local journalist visited the co-working space after hearing about the program from a school principal. She spent an afternoon with Ethan and the students, then published an article in the city paper titled, "From Inheritance to Impact." 1. Man's Mission to Bridge the Divide. The piece went viral within hours. The opening line read, "Ethan Reynolds could have inherited an empire. Instead, he's building something far more lasting." The article included a brief mention of the Reynolds family, the gala incident, and Ethan's resignation, but focused primarily on his work, his students, and his vision. Within days, Ethan received calls from other cities asking about expansion. He received messages from strangers, young people who felt inspired, educators who wanted to volunteer, parents who had nearly lost hope. The website crashed under the surge of new traffic, and Ethan's inbox overflowed with encouragement. But not everyone was pleased. Richard Reynolds saw the article too. A printed copy landed on his desk, and for the first time in months he read about his son, not through the lens of business reports or family gossip, but through the words of a city that admired him for what he had become. He didn't call. He didn't email. But his silence was louder than disapproval. Victoria, however, did respond. She sent a single message to Ethan's phone. "We should talk." Ethan didn't reply. Instead, he focused on the growing network of students now attending weekend sessions, the partnerships beginning to form with local companies willing to offer internships, and the joy on Julian's face the first time he ran his own line of code successfully. One evening, Maya found Ethan asleep on the couch, laptop still open, spreadsheets scattered around him. She placed a blanket over his shoulders, then sat beside him and watched him breathe. He had given up everything they told him mattered. And yet here he was, exhausted, underfunded, overworked, but more alive than she had ever seen him. She whispered into the silence, "You're exactly where you're meant to be." And in the heart of a modest apartment, with nothing but hard-earned hope and a growing circle of belief, Ethan Reynolds continued to reshape what legacy really meant. It started with a ripple. After the local article on Rise Collective went viral, other media outlets began to take interest. A regional news program invited Ethan to speak about the mission behind his work, and though he was hesitant at first, Maya encouraged him to accept. "This isn't about publicity," she told him. "It's about giving people hope, especially the ones who never get to see themselves in stories like this." The studio was modest, far from the high-gloss corporate interviews Ethan had watched his father give on national television. The host, a woman in her 40s with a calm demeanor and sharp mind, welcomed him warmly. They sat on a small set with 2 chairs and a skyline backdrop of Boston in soft blue lights. Ethan wore a plain button-down shirt and jeans. He looked nothing like the heir of a real estate empire, and that was the point. The interview opened with questions about Rise Collective's origins, its mission, and the practical steps Ethan and his team were taking to build access and opportunity. He spoke about the schools they worked with, the mentorship programs, the coding labs, and the students themselves, their names, their stories, their potential. When asked what led him to leave his family's empire, Ethan chose his words with care. "I realized," he said, "that building towers is easy when you have the money. What's hard is building bridges, between communities, between people, between what is and what could be. I chose the harder thing because I think it's the right thing." The host smiled. "Some people say it's a bold move. Walking away from everything." Ethan leaned slightly forward. "The truth is, the only thing I walked away from was an illusion. I didn't lose anything real. In fact, I've gained more in the past 6 months than I ever did wearing a suit in a boardroom." She nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question that had been hovering in the background. "You've come from one of the most prominent families in real estate. Do you think your departure and your new work challenges their legacy?" Ethan paused, then answered slowly, "I think legacy is not about what you leave behind in buildings and bank accounts. It's about what people remember when your name is spoken. If your success can't lift others, it's not success. It's just selfishness dressed as achievement." That single sentence became the centerpiece of every headline within 24 hours. "Success without integrity is just selfishness." It was quoted on social media, shared by education advocates, reposted by influencers, and dissected on podcasts. Ethan's name trended for 3 days, and while many praised his courage and vision, others began to ask uncomfortable questions about the world he had left behind. Reporters started digging into the Reynolds family history. They scrutinized business practices, tax filings, real estate acquisitions that had displaced families, and the growing number of philanthropic events where more money had been spent on flower arrangements than on actual aid. The Reynolds Foundation's last gala came under particular fire when photographs emerged showing the isolated placement of the Carter family table. The symbolism was undeniable, and the public took note. Victoria was furious. In a penthouse, office lined with glass and gold accents, she sat before a flurry of PR advisors and legal consultants, her eyes sharp, her voice cold. "I want this narrative stopped, immediately." One of the younger consultants cleared his throat. "We can't stop it. We can only respond. The public doesn't see this as a feud. They see your son choosing values over privilege, and frankly, they like it." Richard remained silent for most of the meeting. When he finally spoke, it was only to ask, "What's the risk?" The consultant hesitated. "Brand damage, investor confidence, donor engagement. Your name is synonymous with wealth. Now it's being associated with elitism and exclusion." Victoria stood, her jaw clenched. "Then we need to shift the story. Reclaim it." But reclaiming the story proved harder than anticipated. Each time Victoria or Richard tried to issue a statement, it came across as defensive or insincere. Ethan refused all offers to meet privately. He had no interest in repairing an image that had never reflected the truth. Meanwhile, Rise Collective grew. The story prompted new donations, some from everyday people who gave $5 or $10 at a time, others from companies who saw in Ethan's mission a path to something more authentic than tax write-offs. A renowned venture philanthropist, herself a product of public schools and hardship, reached out to Ethan with an offer to fund an expansion. She said his interview reminded her of why she started giving back in the first place. The organization was no longer a small startup. It was becoming a movement, and still the damage to the Reynolds image deepened. A prominent journalist from a national outlet published a long-form piece titled "The Empire and the Exile." It chronicled Ethan's departure from Reynolds Global, the humiliating treatment of Maya's family at the gala, and the secret origins of Edwin Reynolds, a man born poor who had risen through grit and discipline, and whose descendants had tried to erase that history. The article concluded with a stark contrast between Ethan and his parents, casting him not as the rebel of the family, but as the rightful heir to his grandfather's true legacy. The effect was immediate. Investors began pulling out of certain Reynolds projects, A planned downtown development lost its key partner. Several non-profits cut ties with the Reynolds Foundation, citing values misalignment. In one board meeting, Richard slammed his fist on the table. "He's tearing everything down." But Ethan wasn't tearing anything down. He was building something else, something more honest, more inclusive, and far more resilient. When, asked later in a follow-up interview if he had meant to damage his family's name, Ethan simply replied, "The truth doesn't damage anything worth preserving." He didn't need to defend his actions. The results spoke for themselves. Hundreds of students now had access to education and mentorship they'd never dreamed of. Parents saw hope where once there was only resignation, and communities long overlooked now felt seen. Maya watched it all unfold with quiet pride. One night, as they walked home under the dim streetlights of Somerville, she slipped her hand into his. "You know," she said softly, "you've changed a lot." Ethan looked at her. "I feel like I'm finally who I was supposed to be." They stopped in front of their building, the glow of the city humming around them. "You didn't just walk away," she added. "You stood up, and now the world's listening." And indeed it was, not to a name inherited, but to a name redefined. Not to a man molded by legacy, but to one who had the courage to break it apart and build something better. The email arrived in Ethan's inbox on a crisp Thursday morning, just as he was finishing a call with a school in Cambridge interested in partnering with Rise Collective. He almost dismissed it at first glance, assuming it was another invitation to a local conference or a request for an interview. But the sender's address caught his attention. One of the event coordinators from the Global Youth Enterprise Summit, an international conference held annually in Geneva that gathered innovators, entrepreneurs, educators, and corporate leaders from all corners of the globe. The subject line read, "Speaker Invitation, Guys 2025, Ethan Reynolds." He clicked it open. The body of the message was polite and professional, praising the recent growth and impact of Rise Collective and noting the public response to Ethan's recent interviews. It extended an official invitation for him to be one of the keynote speakers on a panel about inclusive entrepreneurship. The panel would feature young founders whose work bridged social justice and business, highlighting new paradigms of leadership. Ethan's eyes moved to the final paragraph, where a list of other confirmed speakers and panel moderators had been included. His breath caught when he reached the final name on the list, Victoria Reynolds, executive panelist and jury chair. The realization hit like a sudden gust of wind. His mother would not only be attending the same event, she would be sitting in judgment, presiding over the very panel he was being asked to speak on. For a moment, he stared at the screen, stunned by the surreal symmetry of it. This was the same woman who had orchestrated the most humiliating moment of his life at the family gala, who had dismissed his values and disdained his choices, who had spent months trying to suppress the story of his departure from the family empire. And now, fate, or something like it, was offering him a stage that would put them in direct collision, not as mother and son, but as opposing figures in a global conversation. He forwarded the email to Maya without comment. Her reply came quickly. "I'll have to go," Ethan replied. "Are you sure?" She called instead of texting. "This isn't about them anymore," she said gently. "This is about your work, about your story. You don't need to prove anything, but maybe, just maybe, it's time they actually listen." That night, Ethan sat alone in the apartment and reread his grandfather's letter. He thought of the man who had built the first blocks of the Reynolds legacy with his own calloused hands, the man who had once said that wealth without empathy was a prison. Ethan had walked away from that prison. Now he had the chance to speak from the outside, to challenge the foundations not with bitterness, but with clarity. He accepted the invitation. The weeks that followed passed quickly. Preparation for the summit was intense. Ethan refined his speech with Maya's help, leaning into his story but anchoring it in data, impact, and purpose. He practiced not to impress but to speak truth, sharp, clear, and undeniable. Meanwhile, Rise Collective expanded to 3 new schools and launched its first mentorship program in partnership with a tech firm that had reached out after the viral interview. When the day of the summit arrived, Ethan found himself stepping off a plane in Switzerland, greeted by snow-covered rooftops and a team of bright-eyed volunteers wearing conference badges and multilingual name tags. The venue was a grand modernist structure of glass and stone nestled along the edge of Lake Geneva. The air was clean and cool, and the crowd diverse, young minds buzzing with ideas, established professionals looking for the next wave of change. On the morning of the panel, Ethan dressed in his usual style, simple, unassuming, and intentional. A dark jacket, open collar, no tie. As he entered the hall, he noticed how different he looked from the other speakers, many of whom wore expensive suits and arrived with entourages. He had come alone by choice. The moderator, a Kenyan entrepreneur named Salim Okoro, greeted him warmly. "Been following your work," he said. "You're shaking things up. Good." Ethan smiled, grateful for the solidarity. But then he saw her. Victoria Reynolds stood near the front row speaking to another panelist. She looked radiant in her signature elegance, charcoal grey blazer, polished heels, hair perfectly pinned. But her eyes, when they finally met Ethan's across the room, flickered with something unreadable. Not surprise, not disdain. Something closer to calculation or perhaps reflection. They did not greet each other. When the panel began, Ethan listened first. The other speakers shared stories of triumph and resilience, of turning personal hardship into platforms for change. When it was his turn, Salim introduced him with a short biography, careful to mention both his lineage and his divergence from it. Ethan took the microphone, walked to center stage and paused. He looked around the auditorium, not at his mother, but at the young people leaning forward in their seats, at the educators and funders who had the power to change lives if they chose to see past titles and lineage. "I was born into wealth," he began, "but I found my purpose in walking away from it." He spoke of Rise Collective, not just the organization, but the spirit behind it. Of students who had never held a laptop now building code. Of parents who worked 2 jobs attending community events to support their children's dreams. Of educators who gave more than they were ever paid for. And finally, he spoke of legacy. "Legacy is not what you leave behind in stone and steel," he said. "It's what you build in the hearts of people. If your success doesn't include the communities around you, you're not building progress. You're building a castle with no doors." The room was silent. Then came the applause. It began slowly, then swelled, until the entire auditorium rose to its feet. Ethan stood still, not basking in the moment, but grounded in it. Victoria remained seated. She did not speak to him after the panel, but later that evening, he found an envelope slipped beneath the door of his hotel room. It had no name, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It simply read, "I heard you." And though no apology came with it, Ethan understood something had changed. Not enough to rewrite the past, but perhaps enough to begin writing something new. The conference hall in Geneva remained a whirlwind of conversation and ideas after Ethan's panel concluded. His words had rippled through the attendees in a way no one anticipated. His quiet confidence, the raw clarity of his story, and the emotional weight he carried as someone who had not only rejected a legacy, but transformed it into a force for inclusion. None of that went unnoticed. Ethan did not linger among the applause. He stepped off stage with the same deliberate calm he had carried during his speech and made his way through the corridor alone, ignoring the reporters and photographers who tried to catch a quote or capture a moment. He wasn't there to perform. He had done what he came to do, speak truth in a place designed to disguise it, but the summit wasn't over. The next morning, the organizers asked if Ethan would consider delivering a closing reflection, a short message before the final keynote. They wanted to end the conference on a note of purpose and conviction, and they believed Ethan was the voice for that. He didn't answer right away. That night, he sat by the lake outside his hotel, bundled in a coat, watching the faint lights dance across the dark water. He thought of Maya, who had stayed in Boston to oversee a new Rise Collective partnership. He thought of the students, especially Julian, who had recently written a line of code that powered a simple chatbot, a victory that felt larger than any acquisition deal Ethan had ever seen his father close. And he thought of Victoria, her letter and those 3 words, "I heard you." When he returned to the summit the next day, he confirmed his participation. The closing ceremony was held in the largest auditorium of the venue, a space that could seat nearly 2,000 people. The mood was expectant. Panels had come and gone, presentations had dazzled and fizzled, but Ethan was now a name that lingered in every conversation. Some were skeptical, others inspired, and a few cautious about what kind of man turned his back on such fortune. But all were curious. When he stepped on stage once again, this time with a full spotlight and the attention of every corner of the room, he felt no fear. He wasn't there for validation. He wasn't there to attack his past or romanticize his journey. He was there to open a door that too many had kept locked. "I want to speak to the ones who were never meant to be in rooms like this," he began. "The ones who are told they don't fit, that their story is too messy, too humble, too inconvenient for the polished narratives these stages usually host." He walked slowly across the stage, voice steady. "I was raised in a world where perfection was currency, where appearances mattered more than impact, where dinner tables were full of conversation about stock portfolios, but empty of anything resembling empathy. I didn't question it at first. How could I? I was a beneficiary. I inherited the keys without even knowing what doors they opened." He paused, scanning the audience. "But then I fell in love with someone who came from a place that system doesn't want to see. A family that lives with pride and humility, not with wealth, but with purpose. And that love didn't just challenge me. It changed me. It forced me to ask a question that too many here avoid. Who pays the price for our privilege?" A hush fell over the auditorium. No movement, just breath and stillness. "I've watched the elite applaud themselves for donating money while stepping over the people they claim to help. I've watched buildings rise on land that used to house communities. I've seen the way some measure progress by the size of their fundraising galas, while the children in those same cities eat dinner from school vending machines." His voice remained calm, but it carried a quiet, unstoppable power. "We tell ourselves stories to stay comfortable. We call exclusion standards. We call separation strategy. We mask our fear of discomfort with a language of legacy and heritage. But legacy, if it can't carry love with it, is nothing more than an echo chamber." He stopped at the center of the stage and looked directly at the front row. "I stand here not because I inherited a name, but because I chose to live outside its shadow. I walked away from everything they said I was supposed to want. And I found more in a single room filled with students writing their first line of code than I ever did in marble offices and champagne-filled boardrooms." The room remained silent, reverent. "I want to leave you with this," Ethan said, his voice now softer but no less firm. "If your success cannot embrace the people who raised you, taught you, cleaned your hallways, cooked your meals, and prayed for you in the dark, then perhaps you are not building anything at all. Perhaps you are simply stacking stones into a castle so high you no longer recognize the ground beneath your feet." A few gasps, a few bowed heads. Then the applause began, slowly, quietly, then growing. But Ethan didn't stay for the ovation. He nodded, thanked the audience, and walked off stage as the clapping swelled into a standing wave that lasted nearly a full minute. Backstage, a few organizers tried to congratulate him, but Ethan simply thanked them and stepped outside. The wind was cold, and the sky was beginning to shift from gray to gold. He pulled out his phone and saw a text from Maya. "I watched, I cried, I'm proud of you, we all are." Another message followed, this one from an unknown number. "I'm sorry. For everything, V." He stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the truth of those words and their weight. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a beginning. As he returned to the hotel, his mind was already turning toward what came next. New students, new partnerships, new cities. His work wasn't done. It had only just begun. But now the world had seen the foundation he was laying, and for the first time, it was listening. Not because of his last name, but because of what he chose to build with it. Not a monument to self, but a platform for others to rise. The days following the summit in Geneva brought a quiet Ethan hadn't felt in months. It wasn't the silence of withdrawal or avoidance. It was the stillness that comes after something true is spoken into the world. The kind of stillness that allows something new to take root. Back in Boston, the pace of Rise Collective resumed with a mix of energy and gravity. The students continued to thrive, partnerships deepened, and for the first time, Ethan felt a balance between the urgency of his mission and the steadiness of his resolve. The video of his closing speech had already been viewed millions of times. Media outlets continued to analyze it, quoting the line about castles without doors, debating whether his message was a call for revolution or reflection. But to Ethan it was neither. It was simply truth shared in a space where it had long been absent. He didn't expect to hear from his family again, not after the summit, not after the rupture that had become so public, so complete. His decision to walk away had cost him their acceptance, and even though the world seemed to embrace him now, a part of him remained untouched by the applause. There was a quiet place within that still remembered the boy, who once wanted his parents to be proud of who he truly was, not just who they had planned for him to become. So when the letter arrived, handwritten in familiar script, he felt the air shift around him. It was a Saturday morning. The mailbox outside his apartment was typically filled with flyers and promotional junk, but among the clutter was a pale blue envelope addressed to him in delicate cursive. No return address, but he recognized it instantly. It was Victoria's handwriting. He hesitated before opening it, standing in the doorway as sunlight poured across the floor. Maya was inside, preparing coffee, the scent of cinnamon filling the air. She looked up when she saw the envelope in his hand and said nothing, just nodded. She understood. He opened the letter slowly, careful not to tear the edges. "My son," it began, "I do not know how to begin this letter, because nothing I say can undo what has already been said and done. I watched your speech, every word. I listened not as a juror, not as a critic, not as the woman who once insisted she knew what was best for you. I listened as a mother who had forgotten how to listen at all." Ethan's eyes moved slowly down the page. "There are many things I must apologize for my pride, for my blindness, for the way I tried to control what could not and should not be controlled, for the way I dismissed your pain, your choices, and the dignity of the people you love. I cannot defend myself, and I won't try. You were right about our legacy, about our hypocrisy, about how far we drifted from who we were meant to be." She had written in pen, and the ink was slightly smudged in places. It looked like the letter had been folded and reopened more than once, as though she had rewritten it many times before. Sending. "You have done something I could never have imagined. You chose truth over comfort, love over power, and purpose over inheritance. And in doing so, you have become the man your grandfather hoped you would be. I see that now. I am ashamed it took me so long. But I am writing not only to apologize, I am writing to ask if there is still a path, however narrow, for reconciliation. Not with conditions, not with expectations, only with the hope that I may come. To know you again, this time not as a mother clinging to an image, but as a woman humbly asking her son to let her learn from him." The letter ended simply, "With love. If you can still believe in it, Mother." Ethan sat down. The letter. Resting on his knees, he read it again, then again. Maya sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "You okay?" He nodded, eyes still on the letter. I think this is the first real thing she's said to me in years." Later that week, another message came. This one through more formal means. It was an email from Richard, shorter, less eloquent, but no less meaningful. "I don't know how to write the kind of letter your mother did. I was never good with words, but I watched the video. I heard what you said. I don't agree with everything, but I respect what you've done, and I'm sorry for what I didn't say when I should have. I hope one day we can speak, as men, as father and son." Ethan stared at the screen for a long time. He remembered the silence at the gala, the stares, the isolation of Maya's parents, and yet now here was a man he had spent years trying to impress, finally speaking to him not as an heir, not as an extension of the Reynolds name, but as his own person. He didn't reply immediately. He didn't know if he wanted to. Some wounds were not healed by words alone. But he saved the message, folded the letter from his mother and placed them in the same drawer as his grandfather's letter. 3 pieces of the same story, finally beginning to converge. That weekend he called Linda and Tom Carter. He hadn't told them yet about the summit or the letters. When he did, they listened in silence as they always had, with patience, with warmth, with wisdom. Tom spoke first. That took courage, on their part, but more on yours. Linda added, forgiveness is a door only you can choose to open. But whatever you decide, we're proud of the man you've become. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window of his apartment, where children played in the street and the world moved forward as it always had, no matter the legacies built or broken. Something had changed. Not everything. Not yet. But something. And, for the first time, Ethan felt the ground beneath him settle, not because he had won anything, but because the walls had finally begun to fall. Not the ones around his parents, the ones around his heart. The days following the letters brought a subtle, steady thaw. Ethan didn't rush to respond. He allowed the silence to stretch, not out of anger, but out of reflection. There was something sacred in taking time to understand what a true reconciliation could mean. Not just for him, but for everyone who had been pulled into the rift between legacy and principle. He had spent so long trying to forget the cold distance of the Reynolds, named that it was difficult now to imagine what a sincere reunion might look like. But the words from his mother, the surprising humility of his father's message, and the gentle encouragement from Maya's family slowly carved out a space in his mind where possibility could live. After weeks of quiet deliberation, Ethan made a decision. He called Maya one evening and said simply, "I want them to come here." She knew immediately what he meant. The idea was not to meet halfway, not to negotiate on neutral ground, not to return to the Reynolds estate or dine in any high-rise overlooking the skyline. Ethan wanted them to come to the Carters' home, to sit at the same table that had once welcomed him with a warmth no luxury ever had. He wanted them to see, not through stories or second-hand apologies, but with their own eyes, the life he had chosen and the people they had dismissed. Maya delivered the invitation herself. She visited Victoria's residence in person, something she hadn't done since that first painful dinner so many months ago. When Victoria opened the door, the 2 women stood in silence for a moment, caught in the weight of everything unsaid. Then Maya extended the small envelope. "We're having lunch on Sunday," she said. "You're invited. So is Richard." Victoria took the envelope without a word. There was no dramatics, no tearful reunion. Just a nod and then the slow, meaningful closing of the door. Sunday arrived with a gentle breeze and the scent of baked bread wafting from the Carter kitchen. Linda had spent the morning preparing a meal with care, though she insisted it be simple. "We're not here to impress them," she told Maya as she stirred a pot on the stove. "We're here to be who we are. That's always been enough." Tom set the table in the modest dining room, his movements steady, deliberate. Ethan paced briefly, checking everything but not out of nervousness, more out of a deep desire for clarity. He had made peace with his decision months ago, but this moment, this gathering, felt like the final thread being woven into a tapestry he had spent the last year stitching. The doorbell rang at 1 o'clock sharp. Ethan opened it to find his parents standing side by side. Richard wore a grey blazer over a black shirt, no tie. Victoria had dressed modestly, her hair pulled back, no jewelry save for a small pendant Ethan had never seen before. They looked different, not in appearance but in presence. There was no air of superiority, no stiffness, just quiet caution. And something Ethan couldn't quite name, perhaps respect. "Come in," he said. The Carters greeted them with warmth. Linda offered her hand to Victoria, who took it with a softness that surprised everyone. Tom nodded at Richard and to his own. Quiet astonishment. Richard extended a hand and shook firmly. The moment was brief, unspoken but powerful. They took their seats. The lunch unfolded gently. Conversation started with surface topics: work, weather, how quickly spring had arrived. But soon deeper currents emerged. Victoria asked about Linda's work with her students. Richard asked Tom about his shop. There was genuine curiosity now, not condescension, and for the first time laughter was shared between them, small, hesitant, but real. After the plates were cleared, Ethan stood. "There's something I want to say," he began, his voice steady. "This past year has been about many things: growth, loss, love. But above all, it's been about learning. And I've learned that reconciliation only means something if it's followed by recognition of who we are, of who we've hurt, of who we could still become." Victoria looked up, her eyes glistening. "I would like to say something too." She rose slowly, placing her hands on the back of her chair. "I can't erase what I said, or what I failed to say. And I will never be able to justify the way we treated you, any of you. I thought I was protecting something sacred, but all I was doing was preserving my own fear. Fear of change, fear of humility, fear of losing control." She turned to Linda and Tom. "You welcomed my son into your home. You loved him when I couldn't see who he really was. And I am deeply sorry. I ask your forgiveness, not just for my behavior, but for the blindness that allowed it." Linda reached for her hand. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." Then, to everyone's surprise, Richard stood. "I've built a life on deals and blueprints. I thought that if something couldn't be measured, it couldn't be trusted. But watching Ethan, watching what he's created, it's made me realize that the things I dismissed are the very things that matter most. I was wrong. About a lot. And I'm sorry too." The room fell quiet, not in awkwardness, but in reverence. The following weekend, a community event was held at a local cultural center in Roxbury, one of Rise Collective's new partner locations. Families from across the city gathered to celebrate student achievements, participate in workshops, and hear from volunteers and mentors. Ethan had planned to remain in the background, but midway through the program, the host took the stage and made an unexpected announcement. "We have a special guest who asked to say a few words." It was Victoria. She walked slowly to the microphone, the hum of conversations fading into stillness. "I was once someone who believed that success was measured in square footage and dividends," she said. "But I've been taught by my son and by this community that success is what you do with your influence, not what you inherit. And it is with a full and humbled heart that I thank you, the Carter family, for showing me what that looks like. Thank you for welcoming Ethan. Thank you for helping him become who he is. And thank you for giving me a second chance to do the same." There were no grand gestures, no standing ovations, but the silence that followed was full of something more lasting: acknowledgement, respect, healing. Afterward, as the sun dipped low behind the brick buildings of Boston, Ethan stood, with Maya, watching children race across the sidewalk, their laughter echoing. Richard approached, hands in his pockets, and joined them. "You've built something good here," he said. Ethan nodded. "It's just the beginning." And for the first time in a very long time, the three of them stood together, not as adversaries, not as heirs and rebels, but as people trying sincerely to begin again. The sun rose gently over the green hills of Vermont, painting the sky in soft pastels as birds stirred in the tall grass. It was the kind of morning that felt like a clean page full of promise. The field behind the old farmhouse had been transformed, not with extravagance but with care. White wooden chairs lined two sides of a makeshift aisle, framed by hanging lanterns and wildflowers gathered from nearby meadows. A simple arch, built from reclaimed barnwood and wrapped in ivy and lavender, stood beneath a tall oak tree where Ethan and Maya would say their vows. There was no ornate cathedral, no marble-floored ballroom, no string quartet flown in from Europe, no diamond-covered chandeliers. But what this wedding lacked in opulence, it more than made up for in truth. Every corner of the field whispered sincerity. Every detail carried the fingerprints of love. It wasn't a performance. It was a union, real and rooted. Guests began to arrive early, greeted not by valets in uniforms, but by volunteers in plain, shirts guiding them toward lemonade stands and handmade fans to keep cool in the sun. Ethan's students helped direct parking, laughing as they offered programs designed by Julian and his coding cohort, each one featuring hand-drawn portraits of the bride and groom rendered in charming digital style. The guests came from every part of Ethan and Maya's journey. School teachers, mentors, community leaders, fellow entrepreneurs, former skeptics turned supporters, and among them sat Richard and Victoria Reynolds. They arrived without fanfare, dressed in subdued tones, sitting quietly among the others, not at the front but neither hidden at the back. Their presence was neither expected nor unwelcomed. It was simply part of the new fabric that had slowly, cautiously begun to weave itself into the lives of everyone present. Tom and Linda Carter moved through the crowd with grace, welcoming guests, offering lemonade refills, exchanging hugs. Tom adjusted the collar of his jacket for the 10th time, while Linda checked the seating one last time, though everything was already perfect. They looked not like hosts trying to impress, but like parents proud to share a moment too long denied them. Inside the farmhouse, Maya stood with her sister and a few close friends. Her dress was simple, flowing white cotton with delicate lace at the sleeves. Her hair was adorned with a single braid woven with wildflowers. She had insisted on no veil. Nothing to hide today, she had told Ethan when they planned the ceremony. Her eyes, when she looked in the mirror, were calm. She wasn't nervous. She was ready. Ethan, waiting by the tree, wore a navy suit with no tie. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, not out of anxiety but in anticipation. His best man, an old college friend, nudged him and said, "She's about to walk out here and change your life all over again." And then she appeared. The music was soft, a guitar, a cello, nothing more. Maya stepped into view, her arm linked with her father's. Tom's expression betrayed his effort to hold back emotion, but his shoulders were straight and his steps were firm. As they walked down the aisle, Ethan's heart beat not with uncertainty, but with an overwhelming, grounded joy. Every face they passed reflected the same quiet awe, the same recognition of something rare, a love that had withstood more than disapproval or disparity, a love that had grown in the shadow of judgment and emerged brighter for it. When Tom placed Maya's hand in Ethan's, the two men shared a look that needed no words. The officiant began, speaking of commitment and kindness, of foundations built not on appearances, but on intention. And when it came time for vows, Ethan spoke first. "I was born into a world where I was taught that love had terms, that success had rules, that families must look a certain way to be worthy. But you," he said, his voice steady but thick with feeling, "you broke every rule I thought I needed. You taught me that love is not earned through approval, but through presence, through truth, through choice. And every day I will choose you." Maya took a breath before speaking, her eyes never leaving his. "I used to think our love would always have to fight, that it would always have to prove itself. But you showed me that we don't have to fight to belong. We just have to stand where we are together. You gave up a world for me, and I promise every day to help you build a better one." They exchanged rings, small silver bands without diamonds or inscriptions, because what mattered was not what the world could read, but what they knew. The officiant smiled, paused, and said the words that brought applause and quiet tears across the field. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." They kissed, not with ceremony, but with joy, and the moment echoed across the field like a bell, marking not just a marriage, but a victory of love over fear, of principle over pride. The reception that followed was a patchwork of celebration. Children danced barefoot in the grass, elders told stories over picnic tables, and volunteers passed out plates of roasted vegetables, grilled chicken, and fresh fruit. There were no centerpieces sculpted by designers, only vases filled with garden blooms arranged by Maya's former students. There was no cake plated by waitstaff, only a towering collection of pies, blueberry, apple, peach, baked by neighbors, and delivered with smiles. Later in the evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the first stars emerged, Ethan took the microphone, not for a speech, just a moment. He looked around, eyes lingering on the people who had walked this journey with him, on Maya glowing with peace, on Tom and Linda, seated beside Richard and Victoria in quiet conversation, on his team from Rise Collective, laughing and dancing nearby. He said, "I used to think legacy was something you inherited. Now I know it's something you build, with the people you love, with the truth you refuse to ignore. and with the courage to start over even when the whole world tells you not to. Then he lifted his glass to starting over, to choosing love, and to making room at every table. Cheers rose, not loud but deep, not performed but shared. As the evening wore on and the music played under the stars, Ethan and Maya slipped away for a moment, walking hand in hand beyond the lanterns into the quiet of the trees. They said nothing for a while, letting the cool breeze wrap around them, letting the world pause. Finally, Ethan whispered, "This was the best choice of my life." Maya squeezed his hand. "Mine too." Behind them, laughter continued. Lights flickered. Families, once divided by walls of wealth and pride, now sat side by side, sharing stories, sharing space. And in that field, under a sky vast and clear, something new had taken root. Not just a marriage, a future.